some sense, nested inside our motivations and emotions and our unconscious mind. And I think there's...
Now, our rationale is also based on our knowledge of things and experience and wisdom also.
No doubt that those claims are correct.
Okay, you forgot a couple of things.
Psychologists have always had an animus towards Freud. It's not exactly clear why. He was a psychiatrist, he was a medical doctor, so maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's the distinction between the different...
Okay, maybe, but maybe it's not a fact, so you're talking about possibility that may or may not. I can't waste my time here.
Professions. But I also have this proclivity to believe that psychologists tend more towards the type of person who's convinced that the primary activities that characterize the human psyche are rational, cognitive, and...
Commercial.
Tout est mieux sans frais. Profitez de période d'essai
Commercial.
et de livraison gratuite. Magasinez en ligne par division.
Stupid commercial.
And we certainly have Freud to thank in large part for making a strong case that that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
You'll encounter lots of psychologists who do their best in some sense to push Freud to one side and consider his theories outdated and unproven. And, I don't really...
If they try to push his theories and prove that how the heck, if a theory is not proved, at least it's space to be a theory. But what's the fact also to say it is a theory, not just a random bullshit? Because there's no evidence to support it. Know what I mean?
I think that's fair.
No.
Partly because the literature regarding psychoanalysis as an effective treatment seems to indicate quite clearly that it's at least as or more effective than other psychotherapeutic schools. And it's basically showed that since outcomes...
Showing that, not proof of it, because you say earlier there's no evidence, so...
Studies of psychotherapy have been conducted, so that's 3 or 4 decades.
By the way, change the name of the psychotherapy because it looks like a therapy for psycho, or if not, the therapy himself is psycho, because this name kind of sucks.
I don't know if there are gender differences. I've actually never looked into that with regards to outcome studies. I don't think they're substantive.
You don't think?
I've never heard much made of them.
So you don't have the knowledge of it.
The other issues that Freud described, for example, that much of our psychological life is unconscious, and much of it is motivated by...
Psychological life is not just unconscious, it's also to having a conscience. If you don't have a conscience, how the fuck are you having a psychological life? First, you must be alive to have a psychological life. Because if you're not alive, how the heck are you having one? Secondly, you're having a psychological life where you're having a consciousness, you're having a psychological life, but also where you are not consciousness and dreaming, you are also having one. So you're kind of right. But it's you're missing detail there.
What are both implicit memories, so memories we don't really realize that we have anymore, or basic biological drives.
That's kind of really sad, because if you're having memory, you don't remember you're having it, it's like put pieces of your life away. That's a mess of something. Worse, it may also changing your behavior, your way of style, even changing a bit who you are without realize. That's really dangerous. Some people hypnose people to doing that in some movie,
That seems to me to be unquestioned. 30 years ago, that psychologists rediscovered the unconscious, and they made a big fuss about that, but I was well versed in psychoanalytic thinking by that time, and certainly didn't regard that as particularly revolutionary, because as far as I could tell, the psychoanalysts had been there 60 years before. In fact, a lot of the experimental procedures that psychologists use to examine the unconscious are derived from the sorts of word associations.
Tell about their name may be better also.
Studies, priming studies in some sense, that Carl Jung pioneered when he was still
Thank
working
you.
with Freud. So
One at least.
we have a lot to thank Freud for.
Okay.
He also introduced and developed the idea of psychotherapy as something distinct from medical treatment for mental disorders. And, you know, I think there is room for
It's kind of funny that the mental treatment, you know, not all category of mental treatment are the same. Talking about the psychotherapy, with some other talking about other kind of stuff. But I am against the people doing the physical one, you know, the medication. Because those are just not extremely unhealthy if you don't know.
variety of opinions about the overall
I make a joke when I say
social and
psychotherapy.
cultural utility of psychotherapy. I've read interesting critiques making the claim that
What was
it's
the joke?
reduced the
I'm gonna make
necessity
pause for that. What was the joke? The joke was simple the name himself.
for familial and friendship ties, for example, as it's proliferated through society. But be that as it may, all of the psychotherapeutic fields that are practically applied, I think, have Freud to thank for their founding.
Okay, you think then?
So it seems a bit on the ungrateful side to criticize him too harshly.
Okay.
I've also found that Freud's conceptualizations of certain pathways to psychological pathology are fundamentally correct. And I'll discuss those in a little bit more detail as we proceed through
Why do
today's
it?
lecture.
I'm
Now,
waiting.
because the late 1900s is now a long time ago, it's useful to put Freud in his historical context.
Okay, about Freud.
So this is partly history of psychology. I
They at
suppose,
least have an image of him, a
but
picture?
also shed some light on how the nature of psychiatric and psychological disorders transform with time, because you know you tend to think of them as, especially if you're more
Ouais, commercial. I hate commercial.
scientifically oriented, you tend to think of a disorder or an illness as something that approximates a scientific category.
Okay.
But the thing about illnesses, diagnostic categories, let's say, is they're not precisely scientific categories. In fact, they might not be scientific categories at all. They're informed by science sometimes, and I would say increasingly as we develop the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, which is the fundamental book that outlines psychiatric and psychological diagnosis, particularly in North America, but increasingly around the world. Science is being used to inform the language that sits at the bottom of the dimensions along which the pathologies are defined. So
For making more simple, science teach how the way of mental illness and how it is defined, how it is, what's the degree, you know, what's the problem, how it works.
for example, with regards to the personality disorders, there's increasing emphasis, although not enough emphasis yet, on dimensional models such as the Big Five. But you
Oh,
have to
boy.
understand that
We talk
medical
about that
diagnostic
one.
categories serve a number of purposes, and you shouldn't get cynical about this. Often people start out by thinking about diagnostic categories as scientific, and then they soon find out that the idea that they're scientific can be criticized on multiple different fronts, and quite severely. Michel Foucault, for example, has done a lot of that.
Yeah, but now it's more video about them than you.
And his works were regarded as revolutionary by people who didn't know anything about the history of psychiatric disorders, because most of what he outlined was already known by people who took the time to know. Partly what Foucault outlined was the fact that psychiatric diagnostic categories, like medical diagnostic categories, play a sociological and political and economic role, as well as a scientific and treatment-oriented role. And that's partly because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture...
Yeah, but the people doing a better role in economic will be the person who work in the economic exclusively. No? Those people. But anyway. Because, yes, of course, any job do work in the economic, but I think the one who really thoroughly work in the economics, they're doing way better. Don't you think? Like an example, any job will work, okay, for the economic of the society.
Series.
But a person that work in economic is way better.
Abnormalities
Literally.
or ill health towards normality or health, and those aren't precisely the same. It's not precisely parallel lines there. You're doing a lot more than science. You're also involved in ethics, and you can't help it. And then, you also have to think about...
Yeah, but also because making the mental health better, it's also make the body better. So you're going also under the health category, in a sense.
Why it is that we have psychiatric diagnostic categories, for example. And, some of the critics of psychiatry, especially in the 1960s, regarded it as primarily an economic or political movement that was designed to...
Not to be an asshole, but if I'm doing one more videos because the icon of the other phone insulting me saying that, I quit too fast.
Categorize people who engaged in abnormal behavior and to prevent them from exercising their full rights in society. Because it was thought of as a purely oppressive enterprise. Now, all you have
Don't
to
talk
do is
about
take
too
a
much
walk
about
around
Star
Toronto
Trek
and see
Enterprise 1.
all the deinstitutionalized schizophrenics wandering around, enjoying their freedom, to understand that the description of psychiatry as a purely tyrannical or oppressive sociological regime has a lot to account for. Because those people were deinstitutionalized in the late 60s and early 70s, and the institutions have never been rebuilt. And all that happened was that they were dumped on the streets, where they generally stopped taking their medication and survived very poorly. So even if psychiatry plays a sociological and political and economic role, don't be thinking that invalidates it as an enterprise. It just means that it's a very complex enterprise that has to span multiple dimensions of... It stands on many different philosophical and scientific foundations.
Yeah, but there's also a lot of company doing those kind of medication also for helping the healthcare. Enterprise or company? Pretty much whatever, because there's a ton of it. I mean, how many, not just for mental health, but also for normal disease. How many medication there is also for just a fucking cold?
Now, psychiatric diagnostic categories and the symptomatology that's associated with them also transforms with time. And that's kind of a strange thing, especially if you think about psychiatric ill health as a biological phenomena. But language transforms across time too, and it's grounded in biology. And the truth of the matter is that nothing that human beings do...
But when you talk about language, you forget about other language. Example, the language of the hand, where people talking with their hand because they don't hear a thing. You think that's what transform also? Or you forget that?
Experience exists in a cultural vacuum. So, for example, when I was young,
Découvre la saveur mystère pour courir la chance de gagner 25 000 $.
a common schizophrenic delusion, especially for the paranoid schizophrenics, was that the TV was talking to them. Now, obviously, they didn't have that delusion in 1920 because there weren't any televisions. So by the time it was, say, 1930, it would have been the radio. And now, the most common focus of paranoia is the internet.
Oh boy, you not even half of it.
And there's some reason for that. I mean, because even if the TV wasn't spying on you, the internet probably is. So that's a simple example showing how cultural transformation can change the contents and the phenomenology that's associated with a given psychiatric disorder. So you can think of them as being characterized.
Yeah, but the problem is that today do exist. It's called a hacker. It's not because people are sick because they're thinking they're being watched by the internet. No, it's because there are really existed one hacker right now. Okay, within government that are from hacker one that also exists. Okay, I'm finished this video. Really good video.